The deadliest gunfighter in the Wild West killed a man for snoring. It is past midnight in a cheap hotel in Abilene, Kansas, and a man lies awake because the stranger sleeping on the other side of a thin board wall will not stop snoring. He calls out once for him to roll over. The snoring goes on. So he lifts a pistol, points it at the wall, and fires through it until the noise stops for good. The man who pulled that trigger was the deadliest gunfighter the American West ever produced. And he was the son of a Methodist preacher, named after the man who founded the church. By his own count, he killed more than 40 people. And after surviving every feud, every posse, and nearly 17 years behind bars, his life ends in the strangest way of all, with a bullet in the back of his head over a game of dice. Before we go on, subscribe and hit the like button. This story is hard to believe, and every hard part of it is real. So here is the question that holds this whole story together. How does a man who feared nobody, who outdrew lawmen and walked out of jails, and never once flinched at the sight of a gun, end up dead on a barroom floor without ever seeing it coming? Keep that in mind, because the answer is the strangest thing about him. Here is the whole of it, before we slow down and walk through it. His name was John Wesley Hardin. He was born in Texas in 1853, the son of a traveling Methodist preacher, who named the boy after John Wesley, the Englishman who founded the entire Methodist church. He grew up with scripture in the house and a Bible within reach, and by the time he was a teenager, he had killed his first man. He would go on to claim more than 40 kills, more than any other gunman the West is remembered for. He ran for years ahead of the law, was finally caught on a train 1,000 miles from home, studied law inside a prison cell, walked out with a license to practice it, and then died on a saloon floor with dice still rattling in his hand. That is the shape of the life. The strange part is how ordinary the beginning was, and how cheap the end. Start with the contradiction. John Wesley Hardin was born in Bonham, in Fannin County, in the northeast corner of Texas. His father, James Hardin, was a traveling Methodist preacher who rode a circuit from town to town, and who also taught school and read law on the side. A respectable man who moved his family from town to town carrying the gospel. He named his second son after the founder of Methodism because he wanted the boy to carry something of that faith. The records describe a sharp, quick child who could read and recite, and who sat through his father's sermons. There is nothing in the early picture that points to what came next. And then the world around him cracked open. Hardin was a boy when the Civil War ended. And Texas after the war was not a peaceful place. The South had lost, and Texas now sat under federal occupation. Union soldiers garrisoned the towns. A new state police force was raised, and many of its officers were black men, freedmen given authority for the first time in a place that had just fought a war to keep them enslaved. White Texans like the Hardins lived inside a defeated, resentful, heavily armed society where the old order had been turned upside down and nobody had yet agreed on the new one. This is the soil Hardin grew up in, and it matters because his violence did not come out of nowhere. It came out of Reconstruction, and his first victims came out of it too. In 1868, Hardin was 15 years old. He got into a wrestling match with a freed slave, a man the records call Mage, and afterward the two argued, and Hardin shot him dead. Then, by his own account, soldiers came looking for the boy who had killed a freedman, and Hardin ambushed them on the road and killed them as well. We have to say this plainly and without dressing it up. His first killings were a freed black man and the soldiers sent to arrest him, and they happened in the racial and political violence of occupied Texas. There is no glory in it. There is just a 15-year-old with a pistol who had learned, very early, that he could end an argument by ending a life. That is the seed of everything. A preacher's son with a fast hand and no brake on it, and the state of Texas was about to spend the better part of a decade trying to put him behind a wall or in the ground. To understand why a teenager could pile up bodies and stay free, you have to understand how thin the law really was. Texas in those years was enormous and almost empty. Hundreds of miles of brush and river and open country with a handful of overworked lawmen scattered across it. A sheriff's authority stopped at his county line. There were no telephones, no fast way to send a description ahead, no photographs in every lawman's pocket. A man who killed in one county could ride 40 miles in a night and be a stranger with a new name in the next. On top of that, the law itself was hated. The state police force raised under Reconstruction was seen by many white Texans as an army of occupation, and a man who killed one of its officers was, to a great many of his neighbors, not a murderer at all, but a hero. Hardin moved through a world that fed him on both ends. The distance hid him, and the politics protected him. That combination is the real reason a boy with a pistol could become a one-man epidemic before anyone managed to stop him. Now we slow down, because the killing years are where the legend gets made, and where it gets exaggerated, and we need to separate the two. Through his late teens, Hardin moved through Texas, leaving bodies behind him. Some of the dead were soldiers and state policemen, which Hardin always framed as resistance, a Confederate boy fighting back against an occupying government. Some were men who crossed him in card games or arguments. The honest truth is that Hardin killed easily, and often, and he told the story of it afterward in a way that made every death sound like self-defense. Like the other man drew first, like he had no choice. The records do not support that version. The records show a young man with a hair-trigger temper and almost no fear of consequence. In 1871, when Hardin was 18, his cousins talked him into joining a cattle drive. The job was to push a herd up the Chisholm Trail, the great cattle road that ran nearly 1,000 miles from South Texas up to the railhead at Abilene, Kansas, where buyers waited to ship the beef east. For most young men, this was hard, honest, badly paid work, a trail hand earning around $1 a day, maybe $30 for a month of dust and danger. For Hardin, it was a moving stage. He claimed to have killed several men on that single drive alone. Herders, men he argued with over crowding the cattle. Men who said the wrong thing. The exact number is impossible to confirm, but even the cautious accounts put it high. And it was at the end of that drive, in Abilene, that the most famous story of his entire life took place. Abilene in 1871 was a wild cattle town, and its marshal was one of the most famous lawmen in the West, James Butler Hickok, the man the world remembers as Wild Bill. The strange thing is that Hardin and Hickok got along. They drank together, by Hardin's telling. The marshal even let him keep his pistols in a town that had banned them. And then came the night that gave Hardin his darkest piece of folklore. Hardin was staying at the American House Hotel. In the room next door slept a man named Charles Cougar. The walls were thin board partitions, and the story that has been told for 150 years says that Cougar was snoring so loudly that Hardin, drunk and furious, fired through the wall to silence him and killed him where he lay. That is the legend. The man so cold he shot a stranger for snoring. But here is where the careful version matters. The Abilene newspaper that reported the killing at the time did not mention snoring at all. It described Cougar sitting up in bed, reading a newspaper, when shots came through the partition and one struck him in the chest. The snoring was added later, by the storytellers and partly by Hardin himself. And Hardin's own line on it became one of the most quoted things he ever said. "They tell lies about me," he complained. "They say I killed 6 or 7 men for snoring. Well, it isn't true. I only killed 1 man for snoring. Even his denial is a confession. Whether Cougar was snoring or reading, a man was dead because his noise annoyed the gunman in the next room." And Hardin climbed out the hotel window in his undershirt and fled, because he knew that if Wild Bill Hickok found him, friendship would not be enough to save either of them. That is the casual cruelty the legend hangs on. But the killing that actually changed Hardin's life was nothing like it. Back in Texas, he had thrown himself into one of the bloodiest feuds the state ever saw, the long and tangled war between the Sutton and Taylor families in the country south of San Antonio. It had started as a quarrel and grown into a small private war, with ambushes and reprisals dragging on for years and pulling in dozens of men on both sides. Hardin married into the orbit of the Taylor side and rode for it, and the feud taught him to think of killing as something owed, a debt to be collected. The feud killings made him a marked man across South Texas. But the moment that truly sealed his fate came in 1874, in the town of Comanche, on Hardin's own 21st birthday. There, after a day of horse racing and drinking, Hardin shot and killed a deputy sheriff named Charles Webb. That single killing changed everything, and it is worth understanding why. Killing a soldier or a stranger or a feud enemy was one thing in the chaos of Reconstruction Texas. Killing a sworn county lawman in front of a town full of witnesses in peacetime was another thing entirely. It crossed a line the state could not ignore. The reaction in Comanche was immediate and furious. A mob formed, members of Hardin's own family and circle were seized, and at least one of his relatives was lynched in the aftermath. After Webb died, the state of Texas stopped treating Hardin as a wild young troublemaker and started treating him as the most wanted man in the state. The legislature put a reward of $1,000 on his head, a serious sum at a time when a working man might earn that in 2 or 3 years, and lawmen across Texas began to hunt him in earnest. So Hardin did the only thing left to do. He ran and he ran far. He collected his wife Jane and his children and slipped out of Texas entirely, east through the deep south, and he buried John Wesley Hardin under a new name. He became a quiet man called John Swain, settling first in Alabama and then drifting into Florida. A married man with a family, a small business, and no obvious past. He bought and sold cattle and timber. He gambled. He kept to himself. For a while it worked beautifully. The distance that had once helped him kill now helped him disappear. He was 1,000 miles from the scene of his crimes, behind a false name, in a state where nobody had ever heard of the Texas gunman. And as far as most of the world was concerned, John Wesley Hardin had simply vanished. A ghost the size of a legend who had stepped off the map. But the same distance that hid him was about to be turned against him. Because the law was changing. The Texas Rangers were no longer just a frontier militia chasing raiders. They were becoming something closer to a modern police force. Men who could work a case patiently, follow a paper trail, and reach across state lines through cooperation rather than force. Hardin had beaten the old system of slow sheriffs and county lines. He had not reckoned on the new one. One Texas Ranger refused to let the trail go cold and followed him clear across the country, not with a fast horse and a posse, but with a detective, a stack of intercepted letters, and patience. Most outlaw stories end with a posse and a shootout. Hardin's captures was stranger and quieter than that, and it nearly went very wrong. The Texas Rangers handed the job of finding Hardin to a young lieutenant named John Barclay Armstrong, and Armstrong worked with a detective named John Riley Duncan. Duncan was the one who cracked it. He went undercover, got close to the family Hardin had married into back in Texas, and listened. Letters and loose talk eventually pointed him to a small town in Alabama, and then to a gambling trip across the state line in Pensacola, Florida. Armstrong and Duncan traveled east, made an alliance with the local Florida sheriff and his deputies, and waited for their moment. That moment came on the 23rd of August, 1877. Hardin and 3 companions boarded a train at the Pensacola depot, sitting in the smoking car, waiting for it to pull out. The lawman had men positioned all around the station. Armstrong, the sheriff, and the deputy stepped into the car with guns drawn. And here, the deadliest gunfighter in the West was undone by something almost absurd. Hardin saw the long-barreled Colt revolver in Armstrong's hand, recognized it instantly as a ranger's weapon, and shouted out as he reached for his own pistol, but his gun caught in his suspenders. The fastest hand in Texas was tangled up in his own clothing. A young companion of his, 19 years old, named Jim Mann, got off a shot that tore the hat off Armstrong's head, and Armstrong shot the boy through the chest and killed him. As Hardin fought to free his pistol, Armstrong brought the heavy Colt down on his head and knocked him out cold. The man who had survived dozens of gunfights was taken without firing a single shot. Beaten unconscious over a snagged suspender, they chained him and brought him back to Texas, and they tried him for the killing of Deputy Charles Webb. The jury convicted him of murder, and the judge sentenced him to 25 years in the state penitentiary at Huntsville. He was 24 years old. By the time the trial ended, the newspapers were crediting him with 27 killings. He himself would later claim more than 40, even 44. The real number is something historians still argue over, somewhere around half of what Hardin bragged, which still makes him one of the deadliest men the frontier ever produced. The legend rounds it up, the records pull it down, the truth sits uncomfortably in between, and it is high either way. And here is where the story takes the turn nobody expects. Because what happened to Hardin behind the prison walls is the part the movies never tell. He went into Huntsville a killer. He did not stay one. The early years were ugly, and the prison itself was a brutal place. A hard labor penitentiary where convicts were worked and beaten and broken on purpose. Hardin fought it. He took part in escape plots. Again and again and again and again he was caught, and each time the punishment grew worse. He was put in solitary. He was flogged. He was made to wear chains. For years the prison and the gunmen simply ground against each other. But somewhere in that long stretch after the escape attempts stopped working and the years began to pile up, something in him shifted. John Wesley Hardin began to read. He studied theology first, the faith of his preacher father coming back to him inside a cell. And in time he took charge of the prison Sunday school, the killer leading other convicts in scripture. He read history. And most remarkably of all, he studied law. Year after year, the most wanted gunman in Texas sat with borrowed law books and taught himself the very system that had hunted him down, the warrants and statutes and rules of evidence that had put him where he was. He spent nearly 17 years inside those walls, almost the whole of his 20s and 30s. It is one of the strangest reinventions in the history of the frontier. A man who had spent his youth answering every problem with a bullet, slowly rebuilding himself around the one tool he had never used, the written law. While he was there, his wife Jane, who had followed him into exile under a false name and waited through all of it, died without him. He came out of prison a widower, a stranger to his own grown children, and a trained lawyer. In 1894, the governor pardoned him. John Wesley Hardin walked free, and then he did the thing that should have been impossible. He passed the bar examination. The killer of dozens became a licensed attorney, a man entitled to stand in a courtroom and argue the law. He set up a practice and tried, by every outward sign, to become a different man. He wrote his autobiography, telling his own version of his life, every killing a justified one. He had survived the feuds, survived the manhunt, survived the suspender that nearly got him killed, survived almost 2 decades of hard prison time. He had every reason to believe the dangerous part of his life was behind him. It was not. He drifted west to El Paso, and the choice could not have been worse. El Paso in the 1890s was one of the wildest towns left in the country, a border city full of gamblers, gunmen, and lawmen who were often hard to tell apart from the criminals they chased. It was the kind of place a famous old gunfighter went to be famous, not to be quiet. Hardin opened a law office, but the work was thin, the town already crawling with lawyers, and the demands on a celebrity killer with a license were few, so he did what came easily. He spent more time at the bar than at the bench. He drank heavily. He gambled. He took to doing trick shooting around town, signing and dating playing cards he had drilled with bullets and handing them out like souvenirs. The lawyer was sliding back into the gunman. And here is the cruel arithmetic of his whole life. He had survived dozens of fights, a nationwide manhunt, and nearly 17 years of hard prison. And what finally killed him was none of it. It was a quarrel as small and petty as the one that started everything, back when he was 15. This is where another real frontier system enters the story. The same kind of gun law that towns all over the West were trying to enforce by then. El Paso in 1895 had an ordinance against carrying pistols inside the city limits, an attempt to drag the place toward order. Hardin had taken up with a woman named Beulah, the wife of one of his own legal clients, a cattle thief named Martin Mroz. Mroz turned up dead, shot by lawmen, and the rumor that never went away was that Hardin himself had arranged it to clear his path to the man's wife. Then one evening, a young constable named John Selman, the son of an older lawman with the same name, arrested Beulah for carrying a pistol in the city, the very ordinance the town was trying to enforce. Hardin was furious. He confronted the younger Selman in public, threatened him, by some accounts struck and humiliated him. In a town like El Paso, with a name like Hardin's, that was not a private insult. Word got back to the father, John Selman the elder, who was himself an aging gunfighter with a long and bloody record of his own, a man who had killed before and would not bear a threat against his son. On the afternoon of the 19th of August, the 2 old gunmen exchanged hard words in the street. Each of them knew exactly what that meant. That night, Hardin went to the Acme Saloon. He stood at the bar rolling dice with another man, and the last words anyone reliably remembers him saying were a call on the dice, 4 sixes to beat. He had his back to the door. He never saw the old man come in. John Selman walked through the entrance with his pistol already drawn, stepped up behind the deadliest gunfighter in the history of the West, and fired a single shot into the back of his head. Hardin dropped to the floor instantly, never having drawn, never having turned, never having had the chance, and then Selman stood over him and fired 3 more shots into his body as he lay there. That was the end of John Wesley Hardin. No duel in the street, no fast draw. No fair fight of the kind the legend always promised. The man who had spent his whole life making other people die without warning died exactly the same way. Shot from behind, over a woman and a quarrel and a game of chance, before he could so much as reach his gun. Selman was tried for it, and the jury hung, and within a year Selman too was shot dead in an alley. They lie buried in the same El Paso cemetery, the killer and the man he killed. So go back to the question we started with. How does a man who feared nothing die without ever seeing it coming? The answer is that the thing that made Hardin lethal was never courage, and it was never honor. It was the willingness to kill first, fast, and without warning, and to call it self-defense afterward. He lived by ambush and surprise, and the body count he ran up, none of it bought him a single second of warning at the end. Speed did not save him. 40 notches did not save him. 17 years of law books did not save him. The preacher's son, who built a legend on killing men before they could react, died exactly the cheap, sudden, undignified way his own victims did, on a dirty floor, with the dice still on the bar.